Good morning. I am so pleased to join you from your cousin congregation, the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbus, Ohio, where I serve as the Assistant Minister of Pastoral Care. I have been a Unitarian Universalist my whole life and an admirer of your tradition for much of it, especially since I met your Pastor Tom in seminary. Y'all have almost everything I love about Unitarian Universalism, plus one more thing: commitment to story, particularly stories about that one remarkable, brilliantly imperfect human being called Jesus. I love your rhythm of reading sacred text one bite at a time, week by week, in a repeating 3-year sequence in community. And I lucked out today being asked to preach alongside Mark chapter 5. The story of the bleeding woman fills me with questions. Why does she have so much faith in Jesus? What did it feel like when she touched Jesus's cloak and was healed? Jesus was startled. What did it feel like for him? Why was Jesus so concerned to identify the person who touched his cloak? And why was she fearful and trembling to step forward, only to spill her whole truth at his feet? What is her whole truth? The authors of Mark don't tell us much, but there is one rich biographical snippet. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. This led me to one of my favorite essayists, Eli Clare, a trans man living with cerebral palsy. Like the woman in Mark, he has endured much. Going to an orthopedist for relief from extreme neck and back pain, he is told, perhaps with good intentions, in 10 years, we'll be able to use micro-brain surgery to minimize or even end your tremors. That conversation was much more than a decade ago, and no cure has materialized. Eli Clare has found healing instead in detaching from faith in cure. He writes, quote, "The folks who offered disabled and chronically ill people prayers, crystals, and vitamins believe deeply in the necessity of cure. They locate the problem or damage of disability within individual disabled bodies and minds. In response, disabled advocates, activists, have for decades said loudly and clearly, 'Leave our bodies alone. Stop treating us as broken.' We have defined disability as a matter of social justice, disability residing not in paralysis, but in stairs without an accompanying ramp, not in blindness, but in the lack of braille and audio-recorded books. Disability itself doesn't live solely in depression or anxiety, but rather in a whole host of stereotypes and damaging material realities. Not in dyslexia, but in teaching methods unwilling to flex. Not in lupus or multiple sclerosis, but in the belief that certain bodily conditions are a fate worse than death." End quote. My sense of the woman with the hemorrhages is that, like Eli Clare, she's given up the cures promised by people who aren't able to see, listen, or believe in her. She's looking for respect. Ablelism is the notion that people like her who can't survive without making a fuss are unworthy of respect. Ableism withholds investments in ramps, closed captioning, and women-led gynecological research because these things do not yield competitive returns. Ableism is the grease in the gears of all other oppressions, Eli Clare says, because it normalizes one type of body and dehumanizes us all. Healing from ableism, then, is not removing Eli Clare's tremors. It is more than stopping the flow of a bleeding woman. I'd like to introduce you to a third person, tell you another story of healing. This one I know to be true. There was once a person afflicted with ableism. They believed that what made them worthy of community was what they accomplished, what they did. Because their own worthiness meant the world to them, they did a lot, starting at a very young age. Fortunate in their birth, they had a strong body, stable housing, food security, and limited exposure to trauma. They were afforded many advantages that accompanied them into adolescence. You can choose several from the list: whiteness, maleness, a cisgender identity, the ability to pass as heterosexual. With several of these advantages in hand, plus a body and mind that fit cultural norms, this person was set up for success. Really, they should have been happy. But there was a hole in their serenity. Out of that hole poured hopes and dreams, fears and love. That's normal, they were told. This is the time in your life, they were told, when you feel all that stuff and you get it out of your system. Time and discipline, growing up, will cure you, and soon you won't have to bother with all those feelings. So they learned to dismiss and distrust feelings, ignoring their bleeding truth. They tried to forget the hole in their serenity and to help the people around them by encouraging them to get their humanity out of their system. When generosity welled up in them, they put their money and time toward efforts to help the disadvantaged become more like them. The people who couldn't improve bothered this person, and so they learned to step over the houseless on the sidewalk, change the channel on the refugees, assume that victims of police violence are criminals. One day, this person was going about their normal life as a human doing, and a terrible, awful thing happened to them. They were reduced to a human being. They could no longer walk, let alone run from task to task. They could not do anything, could not move their legs, could not breathe, could not speak, could not explain what happened even to themselves. This person could not even ask for help, but nonetheless, help came. The urgency with which they had lived their life up to this point was over. The urgency surrounding them now, saving their life, was a completely different quality. Paramedics, nurses, surgeons, all strangers were now doing, but they were not doing as our friend had always done in order to be worthy. No, they were doing, giving, loving our friend. Because our friend, the dear soul, was worthy already, inherently. Whether the person ever walked again, they were worthy. Whether they ever talked again, they were worthy. And so it was that the person who had been slowly dying for years was given new life at exactly the moment they lost everything they had thought was essential. After a long night of transformation, they lay alone, bathed and bandaged in a hospital bed, stilled and silenced by the severity of their injuries. And they felt the morning sun on their eyelids. Banished feelings of love, gratitude, anger, hope, curiosity returned, moistened the person's eyes, tasting of truth. Unable to wipe their tears or even speak in awe, our broken, open friend was healed. They could feel in their body they were healed. Not cured, healed. In their mind's ear, they could hear the words of E. E. Cummings, thawed and now flowing from memory. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day. Our friend, lifted from the no of all nothing, human merely being, not doing, could no longer doubt unimaginable God, could no longer suppress their joy in living, would never again lose faith. This is also what happened to the woman who touched Jesus's cloak. The author of the Gospel of Mark does not tell us what actually happened in her body. Perhaps he was squeamish. Perhaps she chose not to share. It's left open for us so that God may say through the story what we need to hear today. What I hear is that a woman chose to touch a healer. The power of his hands to heal was well known, but this woman had heard his message, and she knew she too had that power. And so she laid her hands on him, and they were both transformed. Jesus wanted to know what and who had changed him. And so she came forward, and they got to know each other. She told him the whole truth. We don't know what that was, but we do know that she said it right there and then in front of a huge, intimate crowd. I can imagine it included her need for help. As a fellow bleeding woman, I can imagine she needed help with laundry. She probably needed help to grow greens and herbs to restore the iron in her body. And I can imagine that with the shame dissolved by Jesus's public, loving listening, her neighbors now had the information and the compassion to bring her water and till her garden. We don't know this woman's name, so maybe the invitation is to see ourselves in her story. We hear Jesus call her daughter. And then after their conversation, Jesus goes forth to meet another daughter, whom we heard about last week, another woman as good as dead, and another mysterious healing with scant detail. But I have to wonder, was Jesus able to save this second woman because of something he received from the bleeding woman? There is something sacred and game-changing about a woman who knows she is already worthy of respect. This is exactly the blessing a girl on the brink of adulthood needs to know in order to know that life amid patriarchy and ableism is actually worth living. It is a blessing we all need, and it is available through the touch and testimony of people with disabilities. I speak of this faith because it is mine too. Because I am the person from our third story, awoken from my ableism by a traumatic loss of able-bodiedness. I preach today in a voice that continues to be impaired by the breathing tube that saved my life. I gesture with hands curled by a spinal cord injury. Like Eli Clare, I cannot leap gracefully down mountains. I walk through my life slowly, accomplishing tasks one at a time, taking lots of breaks. My recovery from my injury continues and will continue for years, and I'm grateful because it comes with recovery from ableism. When I am grounded and honest, I don't have any regrets. Though I tell you, I have plenty of complaints. I told my story earlier in the third person, gender neutral, because I wanted you to see yourself in it. What has happened in your own life? What has happened in your own life to wake you up to your worthiness, inextricable from the worthiness of all? How many pointless cures have you endured? And how many have you inflicted on others? What did it take to begin to heal? What do you need in order to begin sharing that healing with others? Over the next few months, as you work more intentionally to include people with disabilities in congregational life, I charge you to listen for the wisdom in your own vulnerability. Locate your self-respect independent from status, your accomplishments, your abilities. Listen to your heartbeat, and then listen to the heartbeat of all that isn't you. We can only draw the circle wide if we allow our own humanity in first. Blessings.